Okay, thank you so much for joining us. Matt, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so the first thing I will say is there's two experts and me. I'm a family member, and with my wife, we have taught, I believe, either 20 or 21 classes, and somewhere between 550, 600 alumni. So we've gone through many trainings. With Alan and elsewhere, we've gone to behavioral tech workshops, essentially to learn the skills to get passed on to our family members. But the important, I think, thing to think about is realize you actually do have two really phenomenal clinicians on this call who know a tremendous amount. And there's someone who has a different experience, which is me. And I'll make sure that any answer I give is filtered through being both a parent and a family connections leader. And I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Lucy?
Hi, everybody. I am Lucy Payne. I am a psychologist at McLean Hospital. I work in a DBT program with adolescents and their families. I run some of our family programs for parents, and now we're trying to get to a little bit more work with the siblings as our patients come through our program. I'm also on the board of NEA and I've been through lots of family connections groups and trainings. So I'm happy to be here to offer a little bit of perspective and just to say a little bit about how Matt introduced himself. He is such a wealth of knowledge as a family connections leader. So it's great to have his expertise here as well.
Kelly?
Hello, I'm Kelly Gwines. I'm a clinical social worker. I'm the clinical director at the DBT Center of Houston. So I'm a DBT practitioner, I'm a certified DBT clinician, I'm on NEA board, and I've led some family connections groups. I'm also the daughter of someone that struggles with borderline personality disorder. So I'm a family member in that sense. So I've dealt with some of the things personally as well as professionally. And yeah, I'm very excited to be a part of this. And yeah, I echo what Lucy said about Matt. I actually think he's probably the biggest expert here. So we will defer to him.
So Kelly, I'm gonna start with you. Can you tell us what the difference is between emotion dysregulation and borderline personality disorder?
Okay, so I think the short answer is borderline personality disorder is a diagnosis that's received after an evaluation and an assessment where you meet criteria. In order to meet the criteria, I think on the NEA website, there's a fabulous information on there to see what all that criteria is. Emotion dysregulation is something that people with BPD experience. You can have emotion dysregulation and not have BPD. I don't think you can have BPD and not have emotion dysregulation. So it's emotion dysregulation, I would say, is the symptom and the experience. BPD is the diagnosis.
Okay.
Is it okay if we add things from time to time? Because I think it's a different perspective. So when my wife and I started teaching 10 years ago, it was very much in the air that BPD would potentially be renamed emotional dysregulation disorder. And so that was very much in play because what we were seeing across the board was emotional dysregulation of all different types. And what we always encouraged our family members was, certainly at that point, not to get hung up on the diagnosis, to look at the behaviors, look at the skills and how the skills interact with those behaviors and how they can certainly change things. And I think now BPD is the name that is locked in. But I guess the one takeaway for parent, I say, if you're not getting a diagnosis, if someone's not putting the label on, if someone's rejecting the label, I would almost say it is not a battle that you absolutely need to fight.
Mm-hmm. And I can add with a quick definition of what emotion dysregulation looks like, especially for the ones who who don't have a diagnosis. I think the way we think about emotion dysregulation is it's different than being just mad or upset or emotional. It's when emotion is sufficiently high that it gets us to get away from our short-term goals. It gets us to get away from all the rational ways that we can problem solve a situation. All of that goes out the window, and then we become focused on, our long-term goals, and then we become focused on how to get out of that pain, how to get that emotion to go away. And that's when people often engage in a lot of problematic, hurtful, and sometimes behaviors that have long-term consequences, including, yelling, self-harm, or, all kinds of impulsive behavior that you might see with your loved one. So often these sort of impulsive, out of control behavior are coming out of emotion dysregulation, which we think about as a way to regulate their emotions back. So that's just something to think about. And we all get dysregulated, right? So this is not something that exclusive to people with BPD, as Kelly said. Although I think that individuals with borderline personality disorder, they experience this at a frequency and intensity that makes their lives really chaotic, and it becomes really problematic. I think we can all think of a time or two, or maybe many, when we have been dysregulated and did something that maybe when we calmed down, it was like, oh, maybe that wasn't my best choice.
So we've received a lot of questions regarding treatment. So Lucy, I'm going to start with you with a question. How do you decide which treatment is the best? There's DBT, there's mentalization, there's many different treatments. How do you know which direction, which way to go for treatment?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. I think what we do know is that for any diagnosis, any disorder, and BPD in particular, having specialized treatment is always better than having, sort of your run-of-the-mill psychological treatment. I think I like to think of this as like not different than going to a medical professional. You can go to your GP or your family practitioner with a sore throat and, with a rash or something kind of like mild. But when you have things that are kind of complicated, you want to go to someone who's specialized in that. So you wouldn't go to your GP to treat your cancer, right? You would want to go to an oncologist. So with psychological disorders, it's the same thing. We have lots of people that experience anxiety, depression, those kinds of things that can be treated by many psychologists or therapists or counselors. But when you have something like borderline personality disorder, you need someone with the specific expertise. Now, with that said, we have many treatments that have shown to have some evidence of being effective. I wish we were in a place here in the United States, but really I think this is true for most places in the world, that we could just say, okay, go to this provider or this kind of treatment in this circumstances. I think what it ends up being is any specialized treatment that you have available near you is the place to go. So, how to make that decision. DBT is the one with the most support from research. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best of the best, but it's the one that we know that works really well. And it's also the one that's more widely available. To find the DBT provider, I can post here on the chat here in a little bit how to locate a DBT provider. If you can't find the DBT provider, then you can look for other treatments like mentalization, although unfortunately mentalization is much stronger in England and in a few other places in Europe, not so strong here in the United States. Now, with that said, if you can't find those treatments, then going to someone who specializes or is willing to receive some training in these specialty treatments, which I've had before. I discharged a patient, to a place where there was no one around, and her previous therapist was very eager to learn and, enrolled in a DBT training course. And so, that's a place to go. But I know that this is kind of hard to come by.
That's great. Matt, so here's my question for you. If there's no DBT class in your area, what do you think is the best way to manage BPD?
Well, that's a big question. So again, going back 10, 11 years when, my wife and I took our family connections class and we learned DBT skills, the resources available were pretty limited. To find, like with Lucy was talking, to find DBT providers, very, very difficult. And a lot has changed in 10 years. So, the great thing is there's a lot of providers. One proviso I would add, though, is that even if someone is certified and trained and everything like that, when you have someone who's emotionally sensitive, as someone with borderline, it still could be a personal connection they make with that therapist. We have sent people to highly trained DBT providers. Person A works with that person. Person B doesn't, with someone else. So let's take a case of a family somewhere in this country where those resources aren't available. Fortunately, and thank heavens for NEA BPD, there's so many outstanding videos and material and information there that I think if I was in the same boat 10, 11 years ago, I would not feel alone. That's the first thing. And also the fact that that all the family members hopefully can take either a teleconnections or a Zoom-based family connections class. And also think of it this way. Let's say you find a really excellent therapist that connect with your loved one. Chances are, unless they're, in a really rigid DBT program, they're not going to be spending all that much time with that person. In some cases, therapy is an hour a week. In formal DBT, and probably Kelly, you could speak to this, it could be more than that. And also there's opportunity for phone connection as well. So much more involvement. But who is really with that 18-year-old day in and day out? Who is interacting with them? Who has the potential to actually change that lived experience of having that emotional dysregulation of borderline personality disorder? And that's the family member. If they change, if they learn the skills, that environment changes. So I would say that, it's important to look outside for help. I mean, we all do. That's really key. But also know that within yourself, a reimagined, reskilled person, you can bring skills to bear that can change that person's life, even if you're living where there are no resources whatsoever. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind, that you are perhaps potentially could be the key person. We say you have the potential to be the rock for that person, the steady, skill-based, thoughtful person they interact with, where they're going to get those DBT-influenced interactions and skills. Does that sort of answer the question, at least from parental perspective?
That's perfect. That's perfect. Any tips, Lucy, I'm gonna throw this one to you. Any tips that you can recommend to encourage a person with borderline personality disorder to get treatment? We have a bunch of questions that people wrote in that they either believe their daughter has it or son has it, but they're refusing treatment. Any tips or ideas?
Yeah, this is really challenging because, of course, as we know, the individual themselves have to, be willing to go into treatment. We cannot, it's very hard to force somebody into this, into getting treatment. What I would say is typically the times when family members most want to have this conversation is following a crisis, which makes perfect sense, right? Like something just happened and you want to encourage that person to go and get help because the need for help becomes more obvious. My kitty is deciding to sit on my keyboard over here. So what I would say is that actually it's likely that following a crisis or following a very problematic behavior, the borderline person themselves is likely experiencing a lot of shame. So talking about getting treatment and things that they can do to improve themselves might be really difficult. So my suggestion is to wait until they are themselves calm, when things are actually going okay. And you can start the conversation by, talking about how treatment might be able to help them get through some of their difficult times, or might be able to help them reach their goals, especially when they're talking about, oh, I want to go to school, or I want to do this. That's the time when, they might be better able to hear you in terms of, connecting how therapy might actually help them get to where they want to go. That would be my suggestion. And then, of course, it's hard. So while there's, refusing treatment, this might be a place for families, for family members to practice a lot of acceptance, that they are not in treatment right now. Maybe family members themselves can find their own support, like Family Connections or other places of support, to help them get through these, most challenging times. And when their family member decides, okay, I'm ready now to do treatment, then, they will be there to support them.
Great. Kelly, is there hope for someone with BPD? Can they ever have a normal, healthy relationship? And also part of that question is also just people are asking for a definition of what recovery looks like, what remission looks like, all of those words of hope and getting better.
So technically remission looks like you no longer meet the criteria for BPD. So you no longer have those 9 criteria or in some form or fashion. Your emotion dysregulation has gone down significantly. You're no longer engaging in those problematic behaviors, and you're starting to achieve your goals, whatever that goal might be. I've got the job and I've worked the job for a little while, and I've, maintained some difficult situations with a coworker or my boss skillfully. So yes, all the data says that BPD is something that we can recover from, that we can no longer meet criteria for. The way to do that, though, is you actually kind of have to change your brain. And part of that is through learning skills and learning tools of when I'm dysregulated, like to Lucy's, what she was saying, when my emotional intensity is so high and my brain is pretty flooded, I've got to have some ability to bring that down. And over time, my brain stops flooding to that high of intensity because I'm not reinforcing it by engaging in these problematic behaviors. So yes, there is hope. And as far as healthy relationships, absolutely. I've been to weddings of my clients, and I've had couple sessions, in a stage 2 kind of thing. We've moved on to just start to do couples work. And will relationships be probably their most difficult time? Absolutely, but that's us too. I get most dysregulated with the people I love as well. Those are our most challenging relationships. So will they be challenging? Absolutely. Though, can they have a healthy relationship and get married or have a family or whatever their goals are? Yes.
I might add, when people come to the Family Connections class, which obviously I'm going to keep zeroing back on, that first session is like a sea of hopelessness. They don't see any future. They thought their child was going to go to Harvard and become a brain surgeon instead of having the police show up and dealing with that on a regular basis. So their life has changed dramatically. And one thing they can learn from the skills is that, just think about mindfulness, for example, that to be in the moment and to be able to deal with the here and now, and then the next thing, that actually represents hope, as long as that's going forward, as long as they're not looking backwards with guilt and shame and the past. And when people discover that there is that hope, it's an amazing moment. And with borderline, it's especially interesting because we try to make it clear that if someone has borderline personality disorder, when someone has borderline personality disorder, that they in base what I know, based on listening to Alan and other people, that they will actually have that the rest of their lives. You will still feel those waves. You'll still feel that wave come at you. The difference is, with treatment, with the support, with both the family and with, getting treatment from professionals, they now know how to respond to it. There's a skill basis. There's that thought. There's the anger coming. I can now work with primary emotions. There's something where I need to radically accept this moment. Now I need to be mindful. They learn the skills to deal with the borderline personality disorder. And to Kelly's point, that means, well, yes, they can have a job, they can have a life, they can have relationships. A few weeks ago, we had a client who was a daughter of one of our families came, and she said, I want to come specifically to tell everyone, and she had been in a very difficult situation, to tell the entire class that there is hope.
Can I jump in with a question? Okay, so if you are suffering with a loved one that has BPD and you don't live near them and they're in crisis and you want to help them, what is the best way to be supportive for that person?
So if you do not live near them.
Right. So, right.
I think this is really challenging, right? It's one of those things that I think in the life of someone with BPD that we think about managing and figuring out ways to get through some of these situations. It's, these are unlikely to be problems that we solve. But, I think that some suggestion is before a crisis situation, or, if you've been there before the next crisis, to sit down with your loved one and think about who they can reach out to that is within, short distance from them. If they're unwilling to engage in this type of crisis planning, then you can do a couple of things. You can try to figure out some of the local places that might provide some help, including making sure that you know a local hospital and how far it is and those kinds of things. Police will often do well checks and those kinds of things. And then talk to your loved one as best as you can how to respond when they are in a crisis situation, knowing that you can't be there, right? Like you cannot go there. How would be the best way to respond, and try to come up with some sort of a plan, collaborating with them. And if that's not possible, then you can try to cover some bases. Maybe you have a relative or someone who lives down there that might be willing to be a backup. I think a step further than that, which is even preferable, is to talk to your loved one and figure out, okay, how can you actually reach out to me or to anyone else before you're in crisis, right? Like that would be even the preferable. So, can you identify when things start to get difficult, and let me know then, while I still am able to do something for you. Because if you're in the middle of a crisis, then the best that the family member might be able to do is call 911, which is not fun for anybody and very unlikely to be actually helpful for the borderline person. It might, keep them safe, but it's not necessarily helpful in terms of receiving treatment or keeping the next crisis from coming up. Those are my 2 cents. I don't know if others have other things to suggest, but.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. I had one more, Abby. I could do one more. So we were talking about, therapists for the person that suffers from borderline personality disorder, the different DBT, mentalization. What if you are the parent or the spouse and you want to seek treatment for yourself? Do you need to find a therapist that specializes in borderline personality disorder?
No, that's a good question. I think that that's helpful because there is so much stigma about BPD. So having someone who understands, the diagnosis, understands what works and what doesn't work with this set of difficulties, I think can be very helpful. My worry when people go to with people who are not familiar with BPD is that often providers, not knowingly and certainly not with any ill intent, they will make suggestions that we know backfire, right? Like with younger kids, they will often suggest more punishments or consequences and those kinds of things, and we know that tends to backfire with kids with BPD. and with adults too. So, so this is, if you can find somebody who specializes, a lot of DBT clinics have some resources for families. Sometimes it's only for families of people in their, who for their patients, but other ones do provide some classes to the community too.
Yeah, I would echo that with many of our families, there's a certain point they reach where what we say is you need a co-pilot, which essentially you need a therapist that you can sit down and talk to, hopefully with the understanding of DBT, but certainly of BPD, and plan exactly how you're going to go forward. Because even if you're a couple and you're talking to each other, it can still seem very, very difficult to sort out all the possibilities. Because there may be 4 or 5 different directions you can go in. So to have that person is really, really effective. And in our group, we have a resource list. We say, here are some people that people have gone to. We don't recommend people because we can't do that, and say, try to find someone you think might be in the same wavelength in terms of skills and BPD that can help you get through this difficult situation. Like, my son won't come out of the basement, or they won't work, they won't do anything, they won't get any treatment. And you're practicing all your skills of validation and observing limits and radical acceptance, but now what? And that other voice can help you. Like we say, it's important to have an internal dialogue in family connections with yourself, sort of like talk to yourself as you, in a very wise mind way. Having that third wise mind in the room with a couple or a single parent can be absolutely vital. So that's a key thing.
And I would add, if kind of to Lucy's oncology analogy, if you're somewhere where DBT is not accessible, maybe your therapist doesn't know anything about cancer and oncology, but they can know about you. And so I think if maybe you're not going to that specialist for BPD because there's no one there, if you can find a clinician that you have a relationship with, that you can talk about yourself, like, I feel frustrated when, or I'm having trouble in this moment and it's about me. Most clinicians are trained in that. And so I think it's less about, if it's like, okay, you don't know anything about cancer, but let's talk about how the cancer is impacting me. I think that can be a game changer if you can't find a clinician that does know a lot about BPD.
We've had a couple of questions about siblings. So Lucy, are there any studies concerning the effects of BPD on siblings?
We are undertaking this now here in our research group here at McLean. We dug into, like, what do we really know in terms of research about siblings? And the unfortunate reality that I think echoes a lot of the research in BPD and families is that there are none. So there's 0 studies evaluating the experience of siblings. In our family connections study, I think we had a couple of siblings. So we know, at least for adult siblings, they have participated in family connections, and that has been helpful. But for more younger siblings, like teens and young adults, we don't really know much. So we're hoping that here in the next year or so we can do some investigation of that. But what I can tell you about what siblings tend to experience, they usually fall in a few categories. They talk about wanting to know, wanting to have information and understand what is going on with their sibling. So there are ways that the families can talk about in an age-appropriate way. For those that have younger teens and young adults, I highly recommend showing the Open Your Mind videos, and we just posted a link here in the chat room, in the chat. That's an introduction about BPD, and with some of the skills that can be helpful. Or you can just have conversations with them about it. So they want to know, they want to help. Sometimes they feel responsible for caring for their sibling, and they feel like in a parental role. So that can be really challenging. Even if nobody is intending to put them in that role, they might feel that way. And then another thing that I hear a lot from siblings is that they don't want to burden their parents with their own difficulties, even if it's, day-to-day kind of normative difficulties that they might be going through, like, I need to sign a lease, how I do that, or I'm not doing well in my math class, or I'm having trouble with a friend. They often don't feel like they can talk to their parents, not because their parents are not there, but because they know their parents are struggling with their sibling and they don't want to add to the burden. So, this does, I think for parents, this means a lot of things, but, I highly encourage parents to spend some time talking and opening up the conversation with the siblings, because they know, they see what's going on. They're often, if they're not getting the information, they're filling in the blanks with their own understanding, which may not be accurate as to what is going on. So open up the conversation and talk to them and check in on how they're doing with other things.
This is such a big issue that I think 3 years ago, we held a sibling-only 3-hour class where all the siblings who were invited to come could come and sort of learn obviously very basics of the skills in family connection. And we had like 35 people ranging in ages from 14 to 45 that were siblings. And Perry Hoffman, who's the former president, now passed away, of the fantastic organization she helped found, was there. And it showed the scale of the problem, because with siblings, parents want the siblings to be on board with what's being done. And quite often they're not. They're not on board, they're pushing against it. And the best advice we could provide based on the skills is the same skills you're using with your loved one who, quote unquote, has borderline personality disorder. All that validation, all that understanding of primary emotions apply to the other sibling as well, because the whole thing is transactional. It's not like the parents and the loved one with borderline. It's the parents, the loved one with borderline, and this child here and that child there, and the ping pong balls going back and forth. So apply the same skills. And in terms of their own dealing with, because it pains parents not to have the child who doesn't seem to have issues understand, is to realize that they don't understand now. And mindfulness teaches us that that's this moment. The next moment, understanding may come, especially if you're being aware that you're validating them and understanding them. Does that, Lucy, Kelly, does that kind of correspond with what you'd say in terms of?
Absolutely. I think especially with the teen and younger siblings, there's one thing that we hear a lot is like, well, we are, if my borderline child is not, following the rules or not going to school today, how do I justify the other one now doesn't want to go to school either? Right. And that can feel really unfair. It's really hard for teenagers to understand and wrap their head around the nuance of the of what their sibling is going through. And without opening the conversation and using some of the same strategies, like you can totally validate, like, yeah, that does feel unfair. Yeah, no, we're not condoning and allowing your, brother or sister to be home. We're just supporting with what they need. And so, using a lot of those strategies that we talk about of family connections with the sibling, not only helps it feel like it's an even playing field, everybody's playing by the same sort of, skills and rules, and everybody's addressed in the same way, that might start to minimize some of that perceived difference, and sometimes some of the actual difference.
Everyone's going to feel better if they get validated, and if you become that rock with the skills, with the validation for not only your child who's having difficulties, but for all the children in the family, for all the people, even and the spouses too. I mean, that's a whole separate issue. The spouses dealing with this, and all of a sudden the validation goes out the window. Yeah. They forget to use that with them. So really
now, and I just want to take a second to acknowledge how difficult this is for parents, right? Because we're saying use these skills with one kid, now use these skills, now you have to validate the other one, and now you're feeling like, what the heck, like. And one thing that I hear a lot from parents is like, when do I get validated? And
self-validation.
Self-validation, or that one friend or family connections, group person or therapist or someone that can provide you the validation because you need it to. Absolutely.
Lucy, going along with this, we received a question because you're talking about validating. When do you talk about, after validating, when do you talk about how you feel or your opinions from your own experience? I've listened and validated, even though I don't agree. What goes on from there? Can you help me with this?
Yeah, I think that it depends on your goal. You know, it's certainly, when someone with BPD often is very sensitive to emotions, and so their ability to sort of separate your experience from their experience is challenging. So I would say that it's important to share how their behavior might impacted you. If you think about in a very wise-minded, what we call in DBT, we call wise-minded, but you know, if you don't know DBT, it's really just means with your values, right? You know, if they said something really hurtful, it's totally okay to say after you know, the waters are calmer, to say, you know, that was really hurtful. And, you know, I want us to figure out how we don't get ourselves into that place again. I would say it's often not a good idea to share your experience if you are hoping, if your main goal is to get the borderline person to validate you, because that might be a little bit to challenge, especially if they are children, right? So that might be a little bit difficult. But if you want to express how it feels and express a little bit about how this may be impacting you, I think you can do that after validating by using what we call accurate expression. So focusing on your softer emotions like hurt and sad and disappointed, and trying to throw in there too this plan of like, how can we not have this happen again? You know, can we work together on this?
So it's also about timing. I think you have that in there. Like, so if your loved one's extremely dysregulated and they're saying these things, which are just very, very difficult to listen to, the timing is right then and there is probably not the time to say, well, you're making me feel real bad now. You're hurting me right now. As you were saying, that is probably the time you want to validate the person. You want to get to what their emotional source of the emotional dysregulation is. But there's a time and place for everything. And there's a time for, as you said, accurate expression to say, can I talk about a little bit about, I'd like to talk about how I felt, you know, I felt hurt after that conversation somehow. Does that make sense to you? But that after someone's been validated, you spent that time validating. I believe that the magic of validation is that if you do it enough, people are going to be open to validate you. But you know, it's where do you put that train car? That train car is not the first one in the train. It's after you've actually gotten in the zone with your loved one, and then you can talk. Everything's on the table. You can talk about yourself, I think, too.
Kelly, we have a question here. I think this is a loaded question, maybe a couple parts, but I'll read you what they wrote and then you can dissect it and answer it. I keep telling my BPD that I understand their feelings. They keep telling me there's no way I understand, and then they get angry. What am I saying wrong? I'm trying to validate them by saying I understand.
I love this.
That's a great question.
Brilliant question. So common, and I think is so well intentioned from the loved one. Short answer, there's no way you understand. So I think part of that is help me understand. What was that like for you? And if and it takes a lot of skills for someone to, as Lucy said, accurately express and describe their internal experience. So if I don't have the skill to do that, and I don't know why I got so mad and hit my brother, or I don't even know the word mad to label it, then I can't tell it to you for you to then kind of try to get it. So sometimes I think I understand can feel very invalidating, where it's just sure, I've been upset before, or sure, sometimes I don't get what I want, so I understand why you're mad, you know. But being in that someone with BPD's body, Linehan's metaphor is often it's like walking around the world with a 3rd-degree burn, which I really love. And so having that all the time, everything you bump into and everything that touches you and the wind blows a different way is going to be painful, and you're going to experience that differently than someone that doesn't walk around with a 3rd-degree burn. So I wouldn't say that to someone with a 3rd-degree burn. You know, I understand why you're in, so, you know, I get it. I don't have a 3rd-degree burn, so I don't get it. So I think it's super well-intentioned and a kind-hearted thing, and I think it unfortunately ends up invalidating your loved one. So I think the truth is we don't understand, so we want to remain as open as possible to trying to understand, and I want to get this, or maybe I don't have to get it to be helpful, but I want to help you. So I think trying to maybe sit in maybe a place of more openness to get them. And unless you've been exactly there and experienced the exact same thing and the intimacy level is really high, you know, like there's a trust with that, right? When my best friend who's known me for however long says, oh my gosh, I totally get that. That happened to me at work 2 years ago. Remember? You know, then I feel validated. But that takes a lot of trust. That takes a lot of skills. That takes a lot of intimacy for that to happen.
And it's such a great question. And your points are so really, really significant to help people, because like even the 5 of us on this call, we do not understand individually what each of us is experiencing on this call. The emotions, the feelings, the thoughts, the doubts, the confidence, whatever, all of that we do not know. Now we can sort of guess, we can look at body language, hear things, but it would just guess. So imagine, like, let's say your loved one comes home from high school and says, everybody at school hates me. If you lead with the fact that, oh, I understand, you must have had a bad day. I understand what happened. You short-circuited the possibility of actually finding out what happened. You know, so what you really want to do is like, whoa, you know, what happened today? Well, something go on? Did something happen in class? Yeah, well, I was in math class, I did the wrong assignment, and everyone started laughing and making jokes about me. Oh, that must have felt terrible. And what you're actually doing, I mean, I don't want to use the understand word, but you're actually getting little bits and pieces of useful stuff you can talk about. First, you're validating the emotions, then you can sort of problem solve. And so, but the normal thing we are brought up to say as parents is, I understand what you're feeling. And the fact of the matter is, the only person that we can potentially hope to understand on the planet is yourself. You know, you may know if you're good, you know what you're feeling, what's going on. Everyone else just sort of guessing and piecing together. And so it's such a vital question, and it comes up all the time in classes.
Lucy, can you describe the feeling of emptiness? Most other symptoms are further explained, but whenever emptiness is mentioned, it's assumed as though the words were universally innately understood. You're on mute.
I'm on mute. Okay. I think that this is such a good question to follow the discussion we just had about understanding, because I think that unless you feel the emptiness that individuals with BPD and emotion dysregulation talk about, I think it's hard for us to really know what that feels like. So I can tell you what I hear often. It's this sense, I think at the very extreme, it's almost a sense of non-existence. Like there's nothing, even myself, I can't really feel a sense of self, which I can imagine must be extremely difficult and disconcerting, right? Like not knowing what my opinion is, not knowing where to look for my experience. And this intense sense of loneliness and nothingness inside, even when surrounded by lots of people. Often people who describe a big, intense emptiness, they tend to feel regulated by others. So these are people who rely a lot on relationships and on being with other close ones, friends, significant others, to get this sense of emptiness and loneliness filled. So a lot of times what we hear is that when they are with someone, they feel alive, right? They have almost like a sense of reference, like as if I'm nothing, and then you're here with me, now I can reference something about how I'm feeling based on how you are feeling. I think it kind of reminds me of like really little babies when, they are in a new situation or somebody that they don't know enters the room. The babies, they look at the parents, right, to see their reaction. And even young toddlers, they fall, they might hurt themselves a little, but they look at you to see what your reaction is. And then they're like, oh yeah, this hurts. Ah, and then they cry. So I think sometimes it can feel like that for people with intense emptiness, that they have such a hard time knowing how they feel or what's there inside of them, that they might look to others to get the sense of like, okay, I exist, I'm here. This is my best, I guess, attempt to describe what that might feel like.
So I have, to some degree, I have some BPD traits that I've lived with my life and hopefully been able to deal with sort of effectively. So the great thing about that question is you're trying to explain, and you did a really effective job trying to explain something that probably most people don't experience. Mm-hmm. But I think for myself, what it would be like, I love opera. I love cooking. I love hiking. I love playing my board games. And then for some reason, it's gone. And you use the word, it's almost as though the person I am, the Matt who does and loves all those things, sort of has disappeared a bit. And what I think that the danger for those with borderline, and you could check me on this, is that when you feel that void's not pleasant to be in. And unless you have skills to deal with it, to get through that, again, the wave coming, in this case, it's a wave of emptiness. Let's get a car and drive fast. Let's go get a bottle of Smirnoff and see what the fast car and the Smirnoff do. That could be interesting.
Let's feel something.
Yeah, let's try to, because this hole there. And what I think the skills, and Kelly, you must see this with clients, when they have the skills, that they're still going to feel that emptiness. It's just out of the blue. It's chemical, it's social, there's various things making it happen. Having the skills means they can do something about it, right?
Yeah, I would say that I was just thinking, I met with a client last week, first time, and went over BPD criteria, and she was like, yes. It was really validating for her that word is really validating when you experience it, I think, for a lot of people. What I was thinking about is, so we start off, my emotions are completely out of control, right? I've got the car, I've got the Smirnoff, I've done all these crazy things. So then I need some skills to bring the intensity down, which is helping me to regulate. Though in order to not feel empty, I have to also be able to self-validate. And so regulation comes first, and then I can validate, wow, I'm sitting in this opera and I'm feeling really pleasant emotions, and I feel really calm, or maybe I feel really excited. I have the urge to go to another one. All that takes validation skills, which then I know myself. Or I sat at the opera and I was annoyed and irritated and I don't understand the language and I was bored to tears and I'm never doing that again. That takes self-validation skills. So now I can go, okay, don't like opera, not going with Matt to opera again. So that takes a lot of ability to then know how I feel, acknowledge it, become aware of it, validate it, and it be regulated at the same time. So that comes further down the road. So unfortunately, the emptiness often lasts for a long period of time, because I've got to get my emotions somewhat regulated to truly kind of know what I like and who I am and how I feel. Would
you agree that also mindfulness plays a role in the sense that when you do feel that feeling, which, as I said, it's kind of, it can be very, very powerful in its nothingness, we can say that you almost can't push back against it too hard. You almost have to let it be in the moment, not pushing back against it, and just noting, I'm not enjoying the music right now. I'm not enjoying this walk. I'm not enjoying the food I'm eating. And just moment to moment, note those things so you don't get tangled up saying, why am I not liking this? which is only going to make that feeling worse, I imagine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, being able to tolerate emotion is
Right.
hard. You know, if I just start screaming at you, I hate the opera, this is terrible, Matt. You know, I didn't really sit with that feeling to really learn. What did I not think about it? Maybe I just started to judge myself because I don't know Italian, and I started calling myself stupid. You know, who knows, right? There's a gajillion different things that could have happened in that moment. But yeah, mindfulness and tolerance go hand in hand.
Great. Okay, we still have a ton of questions that are coming in, so I'm just gonna keep going through these here. Lucy, I think this is one for you. My daughter diagnosed with BPD will often text me that she is done and going to kill herself. How do I respond to her when she's spiraling out of control like this?
I think that this doesn't get any scarier or any harder for parents. You know, I think this is very much what we talked about a little bit earlier. You've got to do this ahead of time. This is not not something that there's not a lot to do in that moment, except to validate a lot of the pain and a lot of the, you know, the suffering that that person must be going through. I think in that moment, that's really, oh, of course, my dog's gonna bark right now. It's the only thing that we can do is to really validate in that moment. And then when the person is not in crisis, that would be a moment to say, you know, when that happens, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help you. How can we do this? How can you reach out to me earlier before you're feeling so completely hopeless? And then two, how should I respond in that moment, knowing that I can't get you out of that pain, right? I can't rescue you in this moment. What can I do that in that situation? And then the other thing that I would say too is that, you know, if you're validating in the moment of crisis, if that person is saying, I'm done, I'm going to kill myself, and you're going to validate, which makes a lot of sense, you also you also need to validate at other times, right? So spend some time validating if they reach out to you earlier when their pain is not so intense. So when they say, I didn't have a good day today, that's great moment for you to do a lot of validation, right? So think about sort of laying that foundation so that they come to you earlier and earlier, and that will help their emotions not escalate so much.
Matt, here's a question for you. How do I handle my 16-year-old when he goes from 0 to 60 in the blink of an eye and starts throwing things, punching walls, and etc.? You're on mute.
What I said was send him to his room and cut him off from TV. No, again, this is a situation that comes up in all our classes, where first of all, there's the speed of the reaction. So things might be okay, and then whoosh, you're off to the races. And then the intensity of what's being said. And that intensity could involve being told you're the worst parent ever, I hate you, I hate life, I hate everything. And then that could, go from there to where, in many cases, we've had families, they've lost many 50-inch screen TVs that have gone down to the ground. So how do you deal with that? Obviously, that's a very complicated trajectory I just talked about in a very few words. The thing that I think people need to understand that is it all starts somewhere. So in family connections, there's something called transactional analysis. Without not getting too deep into that, it simply says that looking at the various things that happen and what each person in the duo, if you have two people interacting, what they're doing. So let's say your 60-year-old, you may think they've gone from 0 to 60 for no reason at all. Chances are, if you slowed things down, you'd find the reasons. Let's say they're right there now, and they're yelling at you. Well, the key thing you need to keep in mind, and I'm going to go back to validation all the time, is you can validate, wow, you're really upset right now. Oh yeah, I hate you, Dad. You're the worst ever. There's no dad in this block that's as bad as you. So you were upset with me. I guess I must have done something that didn't work out too well for you, that you didn't like. Now, two things. First of all, I'm not coming back with that child in the same intensity, which is another skill from family connections. So I'm trying to maintain a sense of ease, gentleness. At the same time, I'm trying to validate him. I'm using the most benign assumption possible. My benign assumption is something has happened to make my son, who I already know is emotionally sensitive, extremely upset. So all of a sudden, instead of seeing this ungrateful kid who's saying I'm the worst father ever and hates me, I'm seeing someone in pain. My whole mindset as a parent has changed. So, and you bring that into play in that moment, which is going to allow you, again, I always say, it's impossible to teach the skills in 10 minutes, to say, how do you use validation? How do you use observing limits? Because we do have limits. How do you use primary emotions? How do you use mindfulness? Because they all intersect in that moment, so that you may not be able to change the behavior. You may still have those words being said. The TV quite possibly could still go on the floor, but you're not making it worse. One of the key things when Alan Frizzetti trained us years ago, and he said one of the key goals is not to make things worse. And unfortunately, we do. Hold on, mister, you can't talk to me like that. What are you talking about? I'm getting sick and tired of this behavior. Let's throw another log in the fire. Let's pour kerosene on it. So having those skills, and again, I assume there's people on this webinar that a lot of what I'm saying is, what is he talking about? It allows you to deal with this extremely difficult situation in a way that you stay regulated. And the other important thing is, again, same moment, 16-year-old, 0 to 60, out of control, saying terrible things, about to start throwing things across the room, is you're 50% of that relationship. You're 50% of that moment. And if you can stay regulated, in control, in that moment, you've made it better, regardless of what's going to occur. Now, we'd all like those moments not to happen. But, to say, I can give you 50% power to make it better, because that's what the skills do.
Mm-hmm.
Did that answer the question? Sometimes I don't know whether actually I just go off on a tangent, but hopefully it was somewhere in the realm of answering the question.
That was great. I want to thank the three of you. I have one final question. I know that many people have sent in other questions that we weren't able to get to, but we will review them. And if we do have a resource we can send to you, we will send it to you. But I want to end with one question that I'll open up to the three of you. Why is there still such stigma around BPD today?
I can take a couple of guesses. In the professional world, there was long-standing stigma, mostly because BPD was not a treatable disorder for a really long time, and so a lot of people still believe it's not a treatable disorder, so that complicates it. The second piece is that the behaviors are often so out of control that it's the kind of stuff that our society is just, socialized into judging, into not understanding, because our emotions and our behavior are things that we're supposed to have under control, right? We're supposed to control ourselves. And so anybody who doesn't do that is then a failure to society. It's a failure to really be able to regulate yourself. And of course, we know that that's absolutely not the case, but this lack of understanding leads people to become judgmental. And what we say is that then, this judgment and criticism often leads the borderline person and family to withdraw and hide, not talk about their problems, not seek help, not speak openly about what's going on, which then only adds to their suffering, to their sense of loneliness, to that sense of disempowerment. And we know that those feelings don't help anybody's mental health, right? So the more disempowered I feel, the more dysregulated I get, and then I engage in those very same behaviors that people will judge me for. So it's kind of like a cycle.
I have so many thoughts, but Matt, you feel free. Part of me thinks about how our own culture still judges emotionality. Sensitivity is a bad thing. I'm trying to change that. I think we all are, that sensitivity is a strength and not a weakness. So in a global sense, I think that emotions are still things that are weak that you don't show, that you keep under wraps. And this is a disorder where that is impossible to do and ends up being really out of control. I also think the way someone that's dysregulated impacts us. If you're in a room with someone that's dysregulated, or you're in a unit and there happens to be someone with BPD on the floor, that's going to change the whole game. Emotions and dysregulation, it is impossible to not be impacted, because my right brain fires when your right brain fires. So if your right brain is out of control and you're about to throw the TV, that's going to set off my right brain. So I think the way professionals feel in the room and not having their own understanding and skill set ended up creating a lot of judgment and not knowing what to do. And so then therefore it was getting worse. I would say probably contributed to it.
There's something in the material early on that says there appears to be a surplus of stigma with BPD. And the reason it's not hard to see, if your family regularly has the policeman show up at the door for various reasons, if you have these shouting matches and glass being shattered in the house, if you have moments where the neighbor's looking, what's going on there, it's easy to feel stigmatized. And I think both, Lucy and Kelly really made that very clear. So the real question of that is, how do we process that feeling of stigma? And our focus with our parents is to say that once we know this is a disability like any other disability, it's really important to hold on to that. And it's also really important, I think, to be an emissary to the world, to everyone. I'll talk to anyone about borderline personality disorder. I'll tell anyone what I do and what it's like. And you'd be amazed, because you're always 2 or 3 steps away from saying, I have a cousin, we had Thanksgiving and the turkey went on the floor. everyone's like 2 or 3 steps away from having something like that in their lives. So by talking about it, stigma can go down. I think that the world is still going on, and that, for most people, emotional regulation is not an issue. These behaviors doesn't happen, they have normal teenage years. But if we talk about it, we can see it as any other disability, and a disability that now, fortunately, more widely, there's treatment, then that's a good thing. We told one family member that, if someone was unable to walk, you wouldn't have a neighbor or grandma say, tell him to get up and walk, get out of the chair. Well, of course not. He's a disability. He can't get out of the chair, can't walk. But they expect them to be emotionally regulated individuals. So how we counter that, talk about it, talk to grandma, plan the family things, talk to neighbors. And you have to use some judgment and realize you're talking about someone. We also say one last thing, especially for people who might be on the call who are in the midst of this. We say that your loved ones are heroes. They've been given something phenomenally challenging to deal with, and they're dealing with it on a daily basis. By any definition, that's heroic. And the other part is, you're heroes because you also are dealing with something that is phenomenally challenging. So what I'm really saying is, there is a ton of stigma out there coming at us. We need to counter it. We need to have practices that sort of are going to lower stigma and talk about this as we would if it was the 21st century. Oh, it is the 21st century. So we should understand this is a disability.
Thank you so much, Lucy, Kelly, and Matt. I think everyone on this call, Matt, will agree that you are definitely an expert. And
at least I know how to use my mouth and talk a lot.
And Kelly and Lucy, thank you so much for your expertise. And Tina, thank you for monitoring the Q&A in the chat, as always. We will, as I said, review the questions that were asked, and if we have resources on our website or somehow we can answer it with a link or another resource, we will share that with you over the next couple days. Thank you so much and have a wonderful weekend.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.